In the grand scheme of things, there are not that many all-electric estates. Ironically, the Volkswagen Group offers you the most sort of comprehensive options, with the likes of the ID.7 Tourer, the Porsche Taycan Cross Turismo, and then the likes of the Audi A6 Avant e-tron, which we have in for review. Now, there are also alternatives from the likes of the MG5 EV, albeit actually being discontinued right now, the Peugeot, Vauxhall, Mercedes-Benz, and also BMW. The latter two actually being potentially the most appropriate when comparing it to the A6 Avant e-tron. Now, prices for the Audi do not come cheap. They start from a whopping £64,000 and extend up to £85,000 without adding any additional options. Here you've got three different trim levels to choose from. You've got the Sport, the S-Line, and then the Edition 1. And then within these trims, you've got three different powertrains to choose from, with the e-tron Performance, and then the all-wheel drive e-tron Quattro. Then, of course, it's worth not forgetting that you've also got the S6 model, which stands in its own entity with an all-wheel drive and an even more powerful output. That vehicle, however, starts from a whopping £94,000 and extends up to roughly £100,000. Now, in this review, which will be covered in such a format, we'll be seeing if the Audi is actually worth its price tag and, of course, how it compares to some of its key competitors. But before jumping into the video, I would just like to point out that if you do want to find the best deals for the vehicle, make sure you check it down in the description below, in the pinned comments, or even scanning the QR code that will be found on your screen. So yes, indeed, there are quite a few different trims and powertrains to choose from, and it can get quite convoluted, but hopefully after watching this video you'll be very much clear as to which vehicle is potentially best for you, be it in terms of Audi or elsewhere. Now, first off, we have to talk about its electric range. And here in the entry-level e-tron powertrain, you've got an 83 kilowatt-hour gross battery pack. That gives it a range claim, at least on the WLTP test cycle, of 330 to 340 miles. If, however, you go for the Performance, the Quattro, or the S6 models, and just as for your information, I am driving the Performance model, you will find yourself a whopping 100 kilowatt-hour gross battery pack. Now, that gives it a WLTP range claim of roughly 370 up to roughly 400 to 410 miles. Although this actually does become better in the Sportback model, where it goes up to roughly 440 miles. Now, you should know that all the vehicles, no matter which battery pack model you go for, do come fitted with a heat pump. That effectively adds to the overall efficiency when it comes to heating up the cabin, because it effectively uses heat that's dissipated from the vehicle's electronics, such as the battery pack, to heat up the cabin in a safe way, therefore adding to the overall efficiency. Now, in terms of my own range tests, which were done on the motorway, on the country roads, and in and around the city, I netted a very impressive 310 to 330 miles. Now, that is not only one of the longest range figures that I have attained in an electric vehicle, but also in an all-electric estate and also SUV. Yes, indeed, it is actually really impressive. And given the fact that the overall performance of all-electric estates has not been all that impressive across the board. For example, when I did the BMW i5 Touring, the MG5 EV, the Peugeot E308, and to a degree the SW model will be pretty much equivalent to that, and the Porsche Taycan Cross Turismo, this one clearly comes out on top. Now, that could be in part due to the fact that the Audi A6 Avant e-tron is the only one within the Volkswagen Group, let alone some of its competitors, to have that humongous 100 kilowatt-hour battery pack. Because as far as I'm aware, the ID.7 Tourer and the likes of the Porsche Taycan Cross Turismo or even Sports Turismo do not have that huge battery pack. They still do have pretty big battery pack capacities, but nonetheless, the A6 Avant really does come out on top. Now, what I also love is the fact that, very much like the Q6 e-tron SUV, you have actually got customizable regenerative braking and also a full one-pedal drive. Right now I'm driving at 30 miles an hour, and if I were to lift off the accelerator pedal, the vehicle will come to a complete standstill. For those people who have driven electric vehicles before, you know that that one pedal drive is actually really handy when you're in and around the city. It just makes it just a little less cumbersome. And in fact, I just normally like driving it on one pedal mode generally. Now, if that's what's not for you, well, you don't have to go for it. You can shift down on the gear selector, and then you can use the paddle shifters which are found behind, and right now I'm just coasting, and if I were to go on the level 1 mode, the vehicle will start decelerating, and then if I were to go on the level 2 mode, the vehicle will start decelerating even harshly. So therefore it just means that when it comes to having that customizable feel while you're on the move and also still have the one pedal drive, well, it's present in the A6 Avant e-tron, and that's something that I'm certainly fond of. Now, what's also great to see is that you have got dual charging ports. In other words, you've got one with an AC connector, in other words, a Type 2 port for a slower charge, and then you have got the DC and the AC port on the passenger side, very much similar like what you'd find on a Porsche Taycan. It is disappointing, however, that you have got humongous charging flaps, which are pretty slow and electronically operated only. Now, nonetheless, via the DC ports, depending on which model you go for, in other words, the battery pack capacity, you've got up to 225 to 270 kilowatts of capabilities via a fast charger, for example, those that you find on the motorway, therefore allowing you to go from 10 to 80% in a mere 21 minutes. As for the 11 kilowatt onboard charger, it means that if you do connect up via Type 2 port to a wall box that has got 3-phase power supply, it'll allow you to go from 0 to 100% in 10 hours. If you were to connect up to a regular 7 kilowatt wall box, which you'll more commonly find at a household, then it will take you a lot longer. Now, another thing that's quite important is the overall driving comfort. And here it's great to see that as standard, across the entire trim range, you've got acoustic glazing for the windscreen and the front windows. This effectively suppresses exterior sounds and yields for a pretty serene in-cabin experience. In fact, if you want detailed breakdown of the sound measurements within the A6 Avant, then make sure you check it out down in the description below or the pinned comments for my dedicated audio review. In terms of the actual comfort while driving, here it's actually rather disappointing that you've got only dynamic suspension that comes fitted as standard across the entire A6 line. Here you've got a 5-link front and rear configuration. Now, I mentioned this because in the S6 model, you've got adaptive air suspension, which will certainly yield for a bettered experience, and having had this fitted on previous Audi and even Porsche vehicles, I can certainly say the adaptive air suspension will definitely bring things up a few notches. Now, it's disappointing that Audi, yet again, very much like the Q6 e-tron SUV, does not allow you to add this as an additional option. Yet, outside of the UK, for example, across Europe, you can do so. So I have no idea why the manufacturers decided not to include said option in the UK, but it might potentially come out in the future. That is actually quite important because when I'm comparing and contrasting the A6 Avant e-tron with some of its nearest competitors, for example, the BMW i5 Touring, which as standard has an air suspension system at the back, it is actually a lot more comfortable to drive. That's not to say that the Audi is uncomfortable. In fact, it's actually pretty well versed when going around potholes, around speed bumps, and also anomalies on the road, and even when it came to cruising on the motorway, but it just would have been a little bit better and superior had it had that air suspension system, at the very least as an option. In terms of the overall handling characteristics, as it's an Audi, it's no surprise that you have got a decent connection with the front axle. The steering response feels pretty good, specifically in its sport mode preset. However, make no mistake, it doesn't really compare with the Porsche Taycan and is somewhat similar to the likes of the BMW i5 Touring. Here I will say that when you are putting your foot down to the metal and, for example, you're going around certain winding roads, the front of the vehicle, in other words the nose, kind of lifts up a little bit, and that's just due to the sheer power, at least on the e-tron Performance, which is on review, and therefore means that sometimes it does feel a little unsteady and feels like you've got that amount of wind that is kind of being dragged in from the front, as you might expect. Of course, this will become potentially of a bit more of a non-issue in the all-wheel drive alternatives. Speaking of which, this does bring me on to performance, and here there is a lot of stats and figures to talk about, and rather than rambling on about all of them, I'm actually going to display them all on your screen. You'll be able to notice there are two separate figures, and that is with launch control enabled versus disabled, and these are the quoted times from 0 to 62 miles an hour from the manufacturer. Now, yes, indeed, the e-tron Performance have got a rear-wheel drive configuration, while the Quattro and the S6 have got an all-wheel drive configuration, therefore yielding for 2 electric motors, one on each of the axles. Now, the vehicle that is actually on test is the e-tron Performance, and using Race Logic's Performance Box Touch, I had it tested from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 1.59 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.4 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 5.26 seconds, which was pretty much bang on the manufacturer's claim, and 50 to 70 miles an hour in 2.47 seconds. I also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.61 G. The A6 models have also got a top speed of 130 miles an hour, while the S6 models have got a top speed of 149 miles an hour. Now, furthermore, it's also good to see that you've got excellent braking performance. On this press vehicle, there are 350mm disc brakes, and they actually did perform very well and gave me plenty of confidence, namely if it came to an emergency situation. Next up, we get onto its interior, and normally I praise Audi for their use of materials within their vehicles, although the same couldn't be quite said about the A6 Avant e-tron. Let me explain. On one hand, it's nice to see that you've got this kind of soft touch material that's found towards the dashboard and by the center console. Then you've also got nice leather work by the steering wheel, the dashboard, the door trims, and also when it comes to the seats. However, on the flip side, I'm not overly fond of the high gloss plastic, which is very prone to scratching by the center console, and more importantly, the use of harsh plastic that can be found towards the bottom of the center console, the top of the dashboard, and towards the rear portion of the door frames. That to me is not quite acceptable for a vehicle that costs upwards of £64,000, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Now, in terms of the overall practicality, it's a shame that you've got no physical climate control buttons. And here the only physical buttons you have are found at the top of the center console, be it in terms of your physical gear selector or in terms of the volume knob among the on and off button, which seems to work on and off as the name might suggest. Now, you've also got the steering wheel where you've got some physical stalks, and then you've got these haptic touch sensitive buttons that are found towards the steering wheel. Now, before you hate on them like I normally do, they're actually really intuitive and they're not awkwardly placed, so therefore I'm not accidentally initiating them when I am steering at speeds. Here they're actually used to interact with the instrument cluster, or for example to adjust the driver assistance systems, for example the adaptive cruise control. And in my opinion, they are faultless. Now, the same could be said about the wraparound display. First off, you've got a 14.5-inch infotainment system, which is super responsive and intuitively laid out. You've also got a permanent bar at the bottom, which serves as your climate controls that can be accessed at any given point or within any sort of app. I also like the fact that there are certain shortcuts that one can enable. Furthermore, it is very speedy, and it also supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay over a wired and wireless transmission, the latter certainly being appreciated in terms of convenience. Furthermore, these third-party mobile operating systems feed through turn-based navigation directly to the 11.9-inch instrument cluster. So therefore it means that you can keep your eyes further on the road. The instrument cluster itself is somewhat customizable and has got different menus as well. Now, better still, you can also have a projected head-up display, which also integrates augmented reality. And this, in my opinion, is a work of art. It's something that I've noticed in the likes of the Porsche Macan Electric and also the Audi Q6 e-tron, which I both recently reviewed. And it's good to see it's also present in the A6 Avant e-tron. This is really a step forward from the Volkswagen Group and very much sets itself aside from some rival alternatives. The only downside, however, is that it doesn't come included as standard, at least in the normal A6 models. And here it is actually comprised within the Sound and Vision pack, which will set you back a whopping £2,895 in the Sport trim and £3,195 in the S-Line or the Edition 1 trims. Now here you will also find a few different goodies. For example, the upgraded Bang & Olufsen 3D premium audio system. What I'll say is the Bang & Olufsen system is a certain worthwhile upgrade, at least for those people who do like their music, over the stock 10-speaker Audi system that outputs a mere 180 watts. Now, if you want a detailed breakdown of the audio system, make sure you check it out on your pop-up banner or following the links down in the description below or the pinned comments. Now, I would just like to point out that this press vehicle was fitted with the additional virtual exterior mirrors. They're a £1,495 option that can be found in the Edition 1 and the S6 models only. Now, I'm not overly fond of them, and the same could have been said about some other vehicles that I've seen with these digital side view mirrors, and that's namely because of the overall longevity, what happens when that screen stops working, and furthermore, in terms of the depth of field and perception. It just feels everything is a little bit closer than it should be in comparison to, for example, using traditional mirrors. But some people will argue to say that it's a lot more technologically advanced, it looks a lot sleeker and adds to the overall aerodynamics, and in the A6 Avant e-tron they also fold inwards when you're parked, so therefore they don't always stick out, which is a nice little touch by the manufacturer. So moving on, we get onto storage, and here you have got a wireless phone charging bay that is somewhat concealed at the front of the center console. You can also disable the wireless charging if you so wish via the infotainment system. Here you'll find a small little area with a non-slip material which can be handy for placing, let's say, keys or loose change, among a few other things. There are also two USB Type-C ports and also a cigarette lighter. There's also two further USB Type-C ports at the back. And bearing in mind over here, if you do go for the sound and vision pack, they'll be upgraded in terms of the overall capacity that they offer, and it goes up to a whopping 100 watts of capacity. So therefore you can fast charge any sort of device if you so wish. Nonetheless, further down the center console, you've also got two cup holders underneath a retractable area, and then you've also got a pretty large compartment underneath the center armrest. It actually extends all the way down, which was really hard to show on video, towards the middle of the center console. So you can pretty much hide certain goods over here, or potentially you might forget about them, so make sure you check that before you leave the vehicle. Elsewhere, you've got the glove box, which has actually been optimized for right-hand drive vehicles, and then you've also got a small little area towards the driver, which is quite handy, for example, for placing a key fob or your keys. In terms of the door bins themselves, they're pretty large at the front, and while they've not been lined in fabric, you have got a non-slip material. Here you'll easily be able to fit a 500ml bottle. However, the rear two door bins are unsurprisingly a little bit more limited, but you do have a pull-down armrest compartment which will reveal two cup holders. Now, it goes without saying that the boot capacity is extremely important, and here on both the Sportback and the Avant models you got 502 litres to play around with. However, when you drop down the seats, the figure does extend between 1,330 litres and 1,422 litres. In other words, over here you've got plenty of space, and it shouldn't be an issue when it comes to transporting goods. Furthermore, you've got a relatively small 27-litre front compartment, in other words, an area underneath the front bonnet. This can be handy, for example, placing your lesser used goods or, for example, your charging cables. On that note, you have got a 40-20-40 rear split folding seat design with a hatchback and an electric tailgate that comes fitted as standard across the entire trim range. It's good to see that you've got that slide-through compartment, although that can only be dropped from within the cabin, whereas the two rear seats can actually be dropped down fully from the rear of the boot, making it a little bit more practical to use on a day-to-day basis. You've also got a flat loading bay, a retractable and removable boot load cover that can be stored in the underfloor compartment, and here you'll also be able to place a singular charging cable, and furthermore you've also got 100 kilograms of roof load capacity. Furthermore, when it comes to towing capacity, which might be of interest, namely if you're looking at the Avant model, you've got 750 kilograms of capabilities with unbraked trailers and a whopping 2,100 kilograms with brake trailers, which is certainly pretty impressive, namely in the all-electric market. Now, what isn't as good, however, is the fact that the A6 comes fitted as standard with manually adjustable seats, which, given the overall price tag of the vehicle, I do think is quite preposterous. Indeed, if you want electronically adjustable front seats with heated rear outer seats, you'll have to go for the top spec Edition 1 model or for the S6 variant, where the latter will also offer you ventilated and massage functionality for the front seats. Indeed, as standard, you've got heated front seats only with a heated steering wheel and electronic lumbar support. Now, the seats themselves, on the other hand, are actually pretty comfortable and accommodating, at least at the front of the cabin. At the rear, headroom is not too bad, although I was a little bit disappointed by the overall legroom. As someone who's just under 6 foot, I couldn't fully stretch out my legs, which isn't the same thing that could have been said about some of the other electrified estates out there on the market, be it hybrid or fully electric, and therefore meant it just felt a bit more of a squeeze than it should be. This could be potentially because the manufacturers prioritized the boot rather than the overall seating comfort at the back. Furthermore, due to the positioning of the battery pack, and given the fact that this vehicle is also shared in terms of platform with the petrol model, it does mean that the rear seats do not feel overly comfortable because you feel like your knees are kind of propped up. This is an issue that has plagued some of the other electric vehicles out there on the market, and it's a shame that it does actually affect the A6 Avant e-tron as well. Speaking about certain controversial inclusions, this brings me on to its exterior design, because when I first set my eyes upon the A6 Avant e-tron, namely with some lighter shades, for example the white colour finish, I wasn't really taken by it. This is just due to the frontal profile just didn't really look the part, at least not in my opinion. However, with slightly darker shades, for example the pictured blue as well, it actually does look quite streamlined, and therefore does fit with the rest of current DNA of Audi, and furthermore does feel pretty nice and modern. At the front you do indeed have those pretty slender headlights that feed seamlessly with the frontal grille. Towards the side you have got 20 to 21 inch alloys, so yes, they're pretty large and you want to make sure that you don't actually curb them. You've got flush door handles which are actually integrated within the vehicle, and that adds to the overall functionality in comparison to pop-out handles, and also adds to the overall drag coefficient, which is actually pretty low on this vehicle. As for the rear, you've got a really nice profile which is pretty tech focused as well, because in certain trims you've actually got OLED technology allowing you to actually even customize the look of the headlights and the tail lights. A nice little touch, but again might be a little bit over excessive in terms of replacement and therefore the overall technology that's been utilized. Now in terms of your color finishes, it comes as standard in magnet grey. If however you want 2 other shades of grey or 2 other shades of blue, white or black or beige, then it'll cost you an additional £775. Speaking about its exterior profile, it brings me on to safety. Now, the Avant e-tron was not tested, however the regular A6 Sportback was in 2025 by Euro NCAP and was awarded a full 5 out of 5 stars, so one can imagine that this will actually translate to the estate model as well. Here it scored a whopping 92% in adult occupancy, a really impressive 91% in child occupancy, and a pretty good 80% in its safety assist scores. In terms of the driver assistance systems, you've got a plethora of them that come included as standard. First off, you've got adaptive cruise control, which is actually really excellent. It keeps you at a safe distance from the leading vehicle and therefore doesn't feel jerky in the slightest. However, it's disappointing that you'll have to go for the Edition 1 model should you want some steering support as well. This is actually works very well, at least in the vehicle that I was testing, and therefore takes away a little bit of the extra stress when it comes to those more mundane motorway trips. As for the traffic sign based speed limiter and the swerve assist and front turn assist, they're very much appreciated. However, I did find that in certain rainy scenarios, the front emergency brake was actually overly sensitive, something that's actually been a complaint by certain other owners from other vehicles from the Volkswagen Group, and it's disappointing to see it actually present on this vehicle as well. Nonetheless, you've also got front cross-traffic assist, lane departure warning, which I do think is a little bit over-sensitive, a camera-based traffic sign recognition system, which does seem to work pretty much majority of the time, and a driver attention and fatigue monitor. Now, it is worth pointing out that these systems will become re-enabled every single time you power on the vehicle, even if you step outside for just a mere second. That is a regulatory requirement from the likes of Euro NCAP and whatnot, and I do think it's actually pretty annoying to say the least. I think a lot of drivers will also agree with me. Now, thankfully, however, the manufacturer has provided you a few shortcuts. First of all, you've got a button on the steering wheel which can be customized, and that can be used to disable the speed limit warning. Then you've also got a drag function which you can do via the right hand side of the display, and this will effectively allow you to disable the lane assist. Then here you'll also be able to find a shortcut to the driver assistance systems, where you can also add it as a shortcut directly via the infotainment system, which is found towards the right hand side. Here you will then find that you can also pre-configure some of the favorites, for example, the ones that you are going to find the most annoying, and you can quickly disable them before you set out on your drive, or indeed if you're going to be driving around and you've forgotten to do this, you can quickly do this as well. Now, moving on from that, it is also good to see that you've got something called Parking Assist Plus, which effectively gives you 360-degree high-resolution cameras, meaning it'll prevent from hopefully curbing your rims. And it's also very handy because your visibility within the cabin isn't exactly the best. And don't get me wrong, you've got some really nice side windows, which are pretty large, therefore making it very easy to check for your blind spots manually. However, in terms of the frontal vision, the positioning of the rear view mirror just feels a little further down than it should be. And then in terms of the A-pillars, they're relatively chunky. So therefore, when it comes to going around corners, I felt like I had to peer around, almost like I would have to do on a Tesla. Something I don't think I would have been able to say on an Audi, but here we are. As for the rear visibility, it's not too shabby. However, just due to the slope profile and the somewhat raised profile towards the back, it does also mean that rear view visibility can be somewhat limited. But you do have a rear wiper, which can be handy. And of course, just due to the camera-based system and also the sensors that come included as standard, it just gives you some extra peace of mind, namely when it comes to driving at lower speeds, or of course when it comes to going within some parking lots. Furthermore, I'd also like to highlight that the rear view camera also got a washer, which is also appreciated, namely if you live near muddier terrain. Elsewhere, it is also good to see that the Avant e-tron has got a turning circle of 12.3 meters. Not exactly the tightest in the world, but it still makes it quite easy to maneuver this relatively chunky and elongated vehicle. So with all that in mind, it brings us onto our verdict of the Audi A6 Avant e-tron. And I do think over here that the manufacturer has ticked a lot of boxes. And sure enough, it's not quite perfect. First off, in terms of its overall list price, it is actually pretty spenny. Although the same could be said about some of the other premium all-electric estates out there on the market. Then in terms of the overall driving comfort, while it is good, it could have been further improved with the likes of air suspension. And yes, I know that is present in the S6 and available as an option in other countries, but why is it not available in the UK? I do not know. Then in terms of the use of technology, it's certainly appreciated within the cabin, and you've got a plethora of them when it comes to the driver assistance systems, but they can sometimes feel a little bit intrusive. In terms of the rear occupancy space, it could have been also further optimized, and so could have the materials around the cabin. However, I still do think it's a fantastic inclusion. It's very stylish to look at, pretty fun to drive, got a fantastic boot, and also if you compare and contrast it with some of its alternatives, its electric range is absolutely class leading. And as a result of this, I can definitely see myself recommending it, and it gets our Best Buy award. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below and how you feel it compares to some of its competitors. And as a reminder, if you want some of the best deals for this vehicle, make sure you check it down in the links in the description below in the pinned comments or scanning the QR code. And if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.